Happy New Year, everyone. Hope you're excited for another year of these devotionals. And this year, we're going to start out by looking at Jesus, the center of our faith, and going through the Gospel of Mark. Now, we're going to talk about why I chose Mark in a minute, but today I really want to focus on, what the Gospels are and how they work. And kind of an important question that we sometimes don't think about of why do we have 4 different Gospels in our New Testament? They're similar, but they're also different, especially when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's kind of the wild card doing his own thing a little bit. It shows us that, there's more than one way to tell the story. But even though they sometimes don't actually line up, right? Just for example, what women were at the empty tomb? Well, all 4 of them are telling you something different. And so this is a point where we need to recognize that the ancient writers of ancient biographies, they don't have the same assumptions that we do. We shouldn't import our modern assumptions about how you should write on them. All right, we need to focus on how Scripture does work instead of how we assume that it should work. Because ancient biographies were less concerned with things like chronology and giving precise details. They were trying to make a case. They were trying to argue a point. Right? They have an agenda, so to speak, because in their mindsets, why else would you write? And so the gospel writers felt free to move things around, to adapt events to the story that they're telling. Right? That only is a problem to us. It wasn't a problem for them. And so as we look at Mark, one of the reasons we're using this gospel is the consensus is that Mark was the first gospel written, probably written in the 60s. It's also the shortest gospel, and so it's easier to explain that other writers would have added more. They wanted to include more of the story than others, Mark taking it away from what others have written. Tradition says that this was John Mark, who was an associate of Peter's, and so this gospel is the stories that Peter would have shared primarily. And so that's why we believe that this was written a little bit later, because the gospel stories existed just as oral traditions that were passed down by eyewitnesses. And it was only when those people started dying off that they started writing down these stories. And so since each writer tells the story a different way, we can figure out a little bit about their perspective and their purpose for writing if we look at what they include, or we look at what they don't include, and how they organize that material. And so when we look at the Gospel of Mark seems to be focusing on Jesus as God's suffering Messiah. All right, Jesus is the anointed king. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, but not like you think, right? Not like people expected him to be at that time. What Mark is trying to show us is that to be the Messiah means that you're willing to suffer for others, not be some conquering king. So a central verse comes in Mark 10:45, where Jesus says, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many." Now that's one way to talk about who Jesus is, and there are different ways to talk about who Jesus is that are all true. So the question really now is, what's the gospel according to you? How can you let the ancient good news speak to today's situations through your life?